And we move on to the second speaker, who is Gideon Reuveni. איפה אתה? No, sorry. Gideon Reuveni is, I think this thing should be lower, אבל מילא. Gideon Reuveni is professor of modern history, director of the Weidenfeld Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Sussex, has published widely on diverse topics such as historiography, sports, reading culture, Jewish economic history. Most recent book, Consumer Culture and the Making of Modern Jewish Identity, Cambridge University Press. And it won the 2018 National Jewish Book Award. Now, together with Daniel Siemens, he's currently started a comprehensive project on the history of the United Restitution Organization, which I guess is exactly what is bringing him to us. And indeed, he will be speaking on the September 27 German Declaration on the Judenfrage, a misread turning point. סימן שאלה, בבקשה.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation, for organizing this important conference. I have to start, coming from Jerusalem, I have to disagree with Ron Zweig. Schlafstunde is a Jerusalem institution, so don't take that also from us. What you see here is an image that was circulated after the beginning of the negotiation in Wassenaar in a lot of American Jewish newspapers, and you see what is there. But in order to get to this situation where basically Jewish and Israeli representative stand against. Okay, everybody hears me? It goes down all the time. So in order to get to this position that of this encounter between these two sides, some other things needed to happen, and one of the prerequisites or the preconditions that the Jewish side put forward to the Germans was a kind of a declaration in which the German was supposed to, again, and we're going to see why it's so difficult to see what the Jewish side expected, but at the end of that declaration, the Germans were supposed to invite Israel and Jewish representatives to negotiate a reparation agreement. And you all know the declaration, or Adenauer Declaration, of the 27th of September 1951, which officially at that time was called the Declaration on the Judenfrage. That was how this declaration was discussed in the German cabinet and German internal documents. And of course, it also kind of indicates to you, the kind of the long way that we came from that period until, of course, today, but quite quickly at that period. And what I would like to give you a kind of a glimpse into is, and this is very much still a work in progress, is the procedure or the emergence of this declaration, and specifically what really interests me is the text itself, the kind of the story of how the text of the declaration came about. And I think a lot of us use this declaration. It seems like a kind of a turning point, but we are not really aware of how actually it came about. Who wrote the text, what it actually symbolized, how it was interpreted and perceived at that period. And this also kind of brings me to, we're not going to expand that too much about this too much, but to the the framework of how we should actually deal with the topic that we're dealing today. And I think this morning was a lot of talk about working together, about collaboration, cooperation. There's always a kind of avoidance of this concept of reconciliation. Reconciliation has, for some reason, bad press. But I believe that we should start thinking about this process as a whole as a process of reconciliation. And I believe that this declaration, and hopefully I'll be able to kind of, exemplify this in this short talk, was the beginning of that. And I want just briefly to start, and I think this is simply an inspiring way, and this is also kind of part of my kind of work in progress on how now I'm starting to think about this whole procedure. It's the so-called reconciliation pyramid that was developed by our colleague Judith Orbach, which very much relates to the kind of all the attempts for peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians, and she kind of depicts here kind of a 7-stage procedure or stages that she thinks that every side should go through when, in order to get to some kind of peace and reconciliation at the end. And what is interesting about this concept is that it basically kind of concentrates and focuses on this idea of narrative and narratives. And so it starts with the acquaintance of the narrative of the other side, acknowledgement of the voice of the other side, empathy, of course, restitution, responsibility, then a public apology, and at the end, this is the kind of the peak, is narrative incorporated, meaning when the two sides engage with each other, acknowledge each other, eventually they will develop kind of a shared narrative about what happened. I believe that this did not happen in this context of the Luxembourg Agreement. I think it's exactly the opposite. That eventually they started with that, not necessarily we should not see that as a narrative incorporated, but there was a lot of there was a shared understanding about what happened. And I think this morning you mentioned the kind of this, what actually the negotiations are about. And they were not about the past, because this was agreed about what happened. There was a shared narrative already, and the shared narrative is symbolized in this declaration. So there was a lot of, again, I don't need to repeat or to kind of go into too much details into that here, but there was all the time, at least from 1950 to the beginning of the negotiations, all kinds of in-betweeners, kind of what we also call citizen diplomats. And here you have probably the most prominent, Jacob Altmaier, a German Jew, a member of the SPD, Karl Marx, a journalist, and of course, Noah Baron. Unfortunately, I didn't find an image of him, so I put a book, which kind of went between the sides and kind of mediated the expectation of each side. And one of the things, of course, they mediated is this expectation for this declaration. And probably the most, I think, the turning point and the most probably important encounter was between these two men that some of you probably know much better than I do, David Horowitz and Maurice Fisher, who met Konrad Adenauer in 19th of April 1951 in Paris. Now, one of the things that is really fascinating about this encounter, this meeting between them, that they were giving very clear instruction about how to behave, what kind of a script about what they're supposed to say, what they're supposed to demand, how they're supposed to feel even, what we call an emotional script before that meeting. And one of the things, the main kind of messages that they were supposed to convey to Adenauer, who met them with Herbert Blankenhorn, was the so-called declaration of guilt, what the Israelis called the declaration of guilt. They called that in internal kind of discussion, although back then it was already problematic because they knew that it's very difficult to speak to the Germans about German guilt. So they were already kind of sensitive about this word guilt. So you see also back then already in the Israeli and the Jewish kind of correspondence and internal kind of documents, this all the time, this distinction and this discussion about what is the relationship between responsibility and guilt. But what is also interesting here is how they wanted the German to compose this declaration. So it should not be prescribed, yeah? It should come from them. It should be genuine, a genuine kind of feeling of the Germans. It should display moral courage, and it should be kind of, they say here that a perfunctory declaration would not be accepted. So it should be authentic. So although they did not want to prescribe what the Germans had to say, they very much had clear ideas of what will convince them as an authentic, kind of sincere German declaration. And I won't go into that because I'm sure that I don't want to disturb your Schlafstunde, but I would kind of summarize that in these 3 R's: responsibility, recognition, and eventually the willingness to offer reparations. So eventually, after the meeting between Fischer, Horowitz, and Adenauer, the message was accepted, and eventually the German produced a declaration by this man here, Alexander Böcker, who was a German diplomat, apparently a conservative person who left Germany in the mid-1930s, left to Oxford, eventually ended up in Harvard. After the war, he returned, and this is Herbert Blankenhorn joined his team in what will start being as the German Foreign Office. And he was considered as, because he spent so many years in the States and he knew Jews, he was considered as the expert on these issues, and he was assigned this assignment, or this kind of, to write the declaration. We know, or at least I know from other sources, that at this period, and I assume he wrote that in May, June 1951, he mainly consulted with these 2 men, John McCloy, the High Commissioner, and he's one of his kind of major assistant, Benjamin Bottenwisser, who was also a Jew, and he was probably the main person who advised and helped Alexander Böcker in formulating the declaration. So eventually, in beginning of July, and this is the first kind of version of the full declaration. It's very difficult to read here, but so this is the first version of the declaration that was given to Noah Baron in the 13th of July 1951. And once he got the declaration, he got it from Herbert Blankenhorn in Bonn in one of his visits, a kind of a procedure kind of emerged. So he took the declaration, read it himself, shared that mainly with Goldman, who shared that with the Israelis. They kind of collected all the kind of the amendments, the comments, and eventually he put them together in a document. He then sent the kind of document or send the correction, and then he also sent a German kind of clean document with an English translation and said, this is how we want it. And this is, again, why I think it's so an important procedure. The procedure here of what to say and how to say was so central, and it was a back and forth between the sides. And they needed to reach an agreement because both sides wanted the declaration to happen. One of the kind of major things that emerged from this procedure, and one of the emphases, is of course the language. And I would dare to argue that in this process of back and forth, one of the kind of results of that the Jewish side, in a way, taught the German side about how to speak about what's going on, how to kind of conceptualize that. And of course, sometimes they were successful, sometimes they were not. So for instance here, the original version talked about racial and religious tolerance. That, now Germany wants to kind of encourage, create an education system that would eliminate racial and religious tolerance, and they changed that, kind of eliminate racial and start talking about human and religious, or menschlich and religious tolerance. One of the key kind of factor in this declaration, which generally speaking the Jewish side and the Israelis were actually quite happy with this first version, is the opening statement. Now I don't know if probably I don't have time to read that, but also from here, the parts that here are kind of, I crossed them out, these are the Jewish Israeli corrections. So instead of talking about against their Jewish fellow citizens, they put against millions of Jews. Or here, against when they say systematic murder of immeasurable kind of people, they said innocent people. So they were very conscious that they need a language that will reveal more feelings and be forcible about the crime that happened. So the Jewish kind of, to summarize, how the Jewish side read this text. So what was important, the extent of what they thought as the admission of guilt, the commitment to fight anti-Semitism and what at that time was seen as the kind of resurgence of National Socialism, the willingness to take responsibility and offer amends, and the acknowledgement, and this is very important, especially for the State of Israel, because the acknowledgement that the State of Israel is not only a legitimate representative of the Jewish people, but also entitled to get reparation. So the first version did not mention the State of Israel at all. This was inserted by the Jewish readers. One of the probably major challenges of the Jewish readers of the text was this kind of separation or distinction between the German people and the Nazi regime. And the first version said that every unprejudiced observer of the situation knows the German people, in its great majority, did not want the crimes committed against the Jews and did not take part in them. Now you can understand that the Jewish reader until today feels very uncomfortable with such a statement. And this was amended, but at the end of the day, the spirit of this sentence was sustained and remained. So again, just to give you an idea about this process, and this is a letter from Noah Baron to Nahum Goldman at the end of August, already referring to the second draft, and you see that already from the first draft, the second draft was much kind of milder, and he says here, in close please find a draft by Alfred. Alfred is Adenauer, that they had these kind of coded, they either called him Alfred or the old man. I don't think that Adenauer actually, I have reasons to believe, let's put it this way, that Adenauer did not comment on the first draft. I think he only commented on the final draft. And we discussed that with Bruno. Bruno is Blankenhorn, and he agreed that he will try to incorporate the 5 corrections, so they made another correction to the second draft, and he will try to restore as much as possible the feelings, which evaporated from the second draft. And this is actually what I find here also even more interesting. And then Bruno said that he and his friends, and that's kind of always a code name for all kinds of other readers, mainly from the SDU, from the political party who read that, are keen that the matter should raise the minimum public opposition. And this is not an easy task. Mainly he says to them, look, our hands are tied, you have to understand. And they understand. They understand that there are limitations. And they need to find some kind of a compromise. So eventually the final draft reached the Israelis approximately 5 days before the declaration was due. Walter Entain, the general director of the Israeli Foreign Office, again another German Jew, saw that and he was horrified. Immediately he wires Eliyahu Livneh, the Israeli consul in Munich, and he actually tells him, look, you have to go now. I don't care how. Israelis are not actually allowed to contact German officials directly, but you will go to Bonn and stop this. And then he gives them our demands, restore the explicit committing of German responsibility, strong reference to Israel Shilumim claim, and the opening paragraph that you saw before should be restored because it was much more forcible than the eventually kind of paragraph that is here that we eventually spoken. What is also interesting here is this comment here, that this document or this wire was sent in the 26th of September. The 27th, the declaration was supposed to be delivered. So it was too late. And it says, sorry, too late. And this is eventually the opening paragraph of the speaking text or the spoken text, which, again, we don't have now time to read that, but it's kind of a text that doesn't actually say much and doesn't have the commitment that the original text. And if you compare the 3 versions, you see that the last version is the weakest version. And for the Israelis, they really had to kind of swallow that. It was very difficult for them to accept. However, there was one line in the speech itself that was from the beginning to the end there, and eventually I would again argue that became the key kind of element that made this whole thing possible. And you see here the English translation, unspeakable crimes. That's the crime without a name is an unspeakable crime, but it's still a crime. And both sides recognize that. So unspeakable crimes, however, committed in the name of the German nation, and they rendered moral and material reparation. Now, moral and material reparation, that is actually an addition of the Jewish Israeli readers. And why did they add that? The original said, moralische und materiellen Wiedergutmachung. And it was mainly the problem with the Israelis that did not actually understand what the German mean with the term Wiedergutmachung. Now, the problem wasn't their language skills. The problem was that they didn't understand what kind of legal and political implications this term will have. And they wanted to kind of make that more forcible. So in each time that this term was mentioned, you see that there was some kind of, in the draft, there's some kind of a Jewish addition. So here also moral and material, and then eventually also individual, and in other cases, collective. So this sentence of these unspeakable crimes, if you now go after the declaration, if you go, first of all, to the declarations that the Israelis prepared on the day that the German issued their own declarations, the Israeli government issued their declaration, which was, of course, in terms of the language and the emotion, was much more forcible. All the kind of the feelings and the emotion that evaporated from the German version, you find them here. But also you find the sentence that the Germans acknowledged that unspeakable crimes were committed in the name of the German people. So this sentence was the key for this whole process to begin. And then, of course, when you go to the agreement itself, the Luxembourg Agreement itself, the first sentence, the introduction, that does not really give an account of what happened, but starts, whereas unspeakable crimes, criminal acts, were perpetrated against the Jewish people during the National Socialist regime of terror, and then, because of that, you are giving us these kind of reparations. So this is a key factor in creating this, I would say, this shared narrative between the two sides. So I will then stop here, and hopefully we will have a discussion afterwards about this.
נו, אנחנו הולכים מחיל אל חיל. כן, מהרצאה טובה אחת לשנייה. תודה רבה. תודה רבה על sorry, I should speak in English, אוי ויי. כן, hope vergessen. Yiddish was my first language. Thank you so much for the detailed, for the documentation, the detailed documentation, and the way you led us through the discussion about this important turning point a document and the way it came about. But you ended your title with a question mark. You said turning point, question mark, and I think that you gave an answer. It was definitely a turning point, and thank you indeed for that.